Morning all and welcome to the Finance and Services.
Testing 1 2 1 2.
Welcome everyone to the Finance and Services meeting. Agenda's been circulated to all. I'd like to ask Dean to
Tēnā tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tō. Akina ki te kia yaki ana. Tio, hei hei hei.
Janine. Thanks, Janine, for that. I'd like to record the apologies of Mr. Robbie Crawford, who was unable to be here. Second of that, please. Thanks, Mikhail. Confirmation of agenda that was circulated. Oh, sorry. All in favour, please say aye. Thank you. Opposed? Carried. Confirmation of agenda has been circulated. Can I have a second up? All in favour? Against? Carried. Next item, agenda item, is disclosures of interest. Does anybody have any disclosures of interest required to be tabled? Not. Move that the disclosures of interest. We don't need to move that, so thank you. Matters arising from previous minutes. On the agenda item.
So
Page
8.
Page 8, yes, sorry. It's two items as tabled. I have a couple of questions. First one, what actions are required by council to be taken to give effect to the recommendation? The second one, of course, is we've got expanded reporting, which I assume will be from the next meeting, not for this meeting. So, so Janine, if you could ask the first question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the team have had a discussion with the Maritime Safety team in relation to the performance measure as it's currently stated within our long-term plan. And the feedback received is as set out in the report. So while the performance measure references notification of the navigation aid failure to Maritime New Zealand, that's not a legal or regulatory obligation that we actually have. So what, in accordance with our harbour safety plan, our requirement is to inform the Coast Guard, who will ensure that boaties, water users in that area are informed of the navigation aid failure. So it's one where we will need to, as we're working through the long-term plan process moving forward, revise that performance measure or look for a new measure that is actually representative of the actions and responsibilities that we have.
Thanks, Janine. Does anybody else have any further questions on the matters arising? If not, I'd like to move that the matters arising resolution be approved. Do I have a mover? Right, seconder. Thanks, Mikhail. All in favour? Right, carried. Thank you. Next agenda item. Neville, to the table, please. Finance and Service Committee from our Director, Customer and Community Services. Welcome, Neville.
Good morning, councillors. Thank you for your time. I'll take the report as read and just highlight matters and happily take questions. We do have a presentation, which I'll get you to bring up, please, William. So you're familiar now with the dashboard and sort of the format we follow. The report itself.
I don't have a mic. Oh.
Okay, take two. So as I was saying, you're somewhat familiar with the dashboard that we utilise now, and as you know, it has been an iterative process and one to which we've been supplementing and adding measures, and will continue to do so for a little while yet. The report itself covers off a number of key focal areas which are associated with the dashboard, but also a little bit of an overview of the independent excellence assessment that's going to be undertaken, which links to the Chief Executive's KPI, a little bit of an overview of where we're at in terms of our productivity approach, and as requested by Council a little while back, we have our manager, Kim Johnson of our communications and marketing section, who will provide an overview of the activities that they are undertaking. So all that information's in the report, and we will move through it. And as I said, happy to take questions along the way or at the end. So if you can move on in the presentation, please, William. So this is the full year dashboard as it stood at the end of June of this year. And it shows at a high level how we're tracking against the 5 key outcome areas, 2 of which, excellence and innovation, have little measures being put into them. So the excellence measure, is will be dependent upon the outcome of the council mark assessment about to be undertaken and commence in September, and that will give us a program of work and a methodology for measuring how we're performing against that program of work. The innovation area is really focused on projects and how well they track, how well they perform, and the benefits that they realise. That is clearly linked to a system that we use called PSODA, in which all of our projects are put and managed and reported on. There's some technical functionality that's still required to be developed in that space, but that will provide us with a view of quantum of projects tracking against budget and against outcomes and delivery of benefits. So it is a very complex tool with a lot of projects, as you can imagine, going through it. And so we just need to be very precise in terms of extracting that measurement. We were really pleased with our culture results at that point in time. We had a couple off track, but we primarily are associated with leave balances and turnover rates. They were key constraints. Our customer data, we're happy with it, but in saying that, these are year-end results for last year, and what we're noticing from July forward is that we've had a drop in some of our customer figures, which aren't represented in the data in front of you, and that's primarily related to timeliness. And we haven't got to the bottom of why. I'm still asking some questions, but it appears to be there's some constraint in the system somewhere that's delaying our responsiveness to customer inquiries, and that information is starting to flow through on the verbatims that we collect from customer feedback. So we need to get to the nub of that. This is one of the issues that the centralisation, customer centralisation project is designed to remediate, where we have a greater capability and capacity across the network to be able to take on tasks where there might be a limited capacity in one part of the organisation to deal with them. So that's a longer term, medium to longer term solution, but in the interim we do seem to have a capacity constraint in parts of the organisation. So really that's the high level of the dashboard, the Te Ao Māori component. We've got some good progress tracking there against both our statutory requirements and our internal capacity and capability functions, which are the 2 key areas of measurement in that part of the dashboard. We know we have got further work to do in terms of some of our joint management agreements and the arrangements that we've agreed to implement there. However, none of the ones that we're reporting as being off track are a surprise to our iwi partners or ourselves, and they are largely agreed to be deferred or delayed because of capacity and capability constraints. As the report mentions, we also rolled out a number of new measures into the dashboard over the recent times, and we now have 40 measures across all 5 performance areas now being reported, and those additional ones which I talked about in respect to the excellence program and the innovation program of work are coming on board over the next 6 months. If you're happy with that part of the report, just give you a brief overview.
Maybe we can, I've just got a couple of questions,
Sure.
Neville, and I'll invite questions from other members of the committee. In relation to customer service, who do you regard as a customer in terms of the performance measurement?
It's really anyone who transacts or receives a service from us. So, and our general measurement criteria is if that encounter is recorded within our IRIS information system. So it's not all, so that's fairly broad. We've expanded that to enable staff in the field where an encounter might not be recorded to offer a QR code to a customer so that they can scan the code and then they get access to the same database and record their encounter accordingly. So it could be a farmer in the field. It could be somebody entering into our transport centre and transacting with staff in the transport centre. They can just scan that QR code and go straight to the application. So in broad sense, it's any customer who transacts with us.
Thank you. So there's obviously this is as at the end of June, the report is, so anything that's happened subsequent is not going to be reflected in these because...
Not in this report, though, it is in the dashboard. Hence why I've raised the issue that we do seem to have a capacity constraint in the system at the moment that we need to get in to find out why there is that anomaly. So yeah, it's presenting a good information for our financial year ended, but yes, there's some downward tracking.
I am aware of a massive amount of dissatisfaction with some, as a result of some actions that were taken by Regional Council recently, and other members of the committee here who are also aware of the same issues. So I'd expect that to be, it probably won't be reflected because these farmers generally won't engage through online portals, so which is unfortunate, but that's just the nature of the beast, I guess. Has anybody else got any questions of Noel?
I've been asked to attend today by Robbie, who's unable to be here. Can I just ask a brutal question? And what real validity does this have? Because we talk about capacity issues, items under customer not represented in the data, innovation, we don't monitor anything, no targets. So why is it even there? I suppose I'm a bit cynical, and it's easy to just put up graphs and say that we're on track or we're off track. And you've talked about these other issues about capacity. And so how much can anyone have reassurance? And I suppose that's what we're looking for, is assurance, reassurance, whatever, that these do truly reflect what's really going on.
Really relevant questions. Measuring the customer experience is challenging, but I think what we've developed in terms of the survey process that we use is now broader and more far-reaching than it was a few years ago, and that we can offer that opportunity to anyone we have an encounter with in the field or in the transport centre, for example, whether they choose to use it or not. So we get about a 30% response rate from people who are offered the opportunity. So it's never going to be 100%. And what we're trying to measure is the sentiment of people around that service. So do they trust us to deliver what we say we will? Do we do it in a timely fashion? and do we do it with quality? So those are kind of the three sentiments we're assessing when we're asking these questions. We have also broadened it slightly, and we're just waiting for some information to flow through on that around how customers feel about their digital experience with us. And similar questions, so I guess in answer to your question, it is a hard one to assess the quality side in respect to how people feel about a service, but that opportunity is there. We then counter that up with, so what were the metrics around the timeliness of answering phone calls? How many calls did we actually answer? How quickly did we answer them? How many didn't we answer? So that's another interface metric. Another one is around how quickly we respond to inquiries that might be sent through the mail. So all of these all add up to a set of data points that give us an overall view. And we don't put in place data points unless they are sustainable and can be investigated and drilled into. If they can't meet that criteria, we won't use them. So they've got to be relatively agnostic, and they've got to be relatively, well, pure. And there are a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data, but you can test them against each other. So for example, when we see a poor result starting to come through around timeliness of responses, we look for the verbatims, which is a narrative that tells us when people report, I think you did a 0 job out of 10. We can look at that and find out, well, why? And we can go right back to the encounter that triggered that particular response. So I think, we have got a degree of depth and analysis in there. It is complex to prepare this information and to keep it relevant and one, identify it in the first place, and two, filter it through into these dashboards and present it in a way that we can actually do something about. And the excellence and the innovation ones, you're right. They are empty boxes, largely speaking. The measures will be set when we have the plan. So when we get the plan to do stuff about responding to our excellence outcome from that survey, then that will be about how well are we delivering against that plan? Are we hitting the milestones we've set? And is that achieving the result that we're seeking? And similar with the innovation from getting reports out, which will be very pure because they're about projects and how well they've been executed, how well they've tracked against budget, and whether or not they've released the benefits that they were expected to. A long answer, I'm sorry, but it is a complex structure.
Chair, just to follow up, but don't want to take too much more time. There's an incident that Chris alluded to, which some in the room are aware of. Chief Executive meeting recently, but the farming sector, dairy sector, up in angst from communication from recently. And as Chris said, that's not true because of the trust issues that perhaps that sector with the region. But that, how would that be captured if they don't engage?
It's a good question. They theoretically, our staff members could offer the opportunity for them via that QR code that I've spoken about, which should be on their phone. And they should be able to step up in that, because that is a customer encounter, be it virtual or physical, and they could offer that. And we would encourage our staff to do that. And then they could report, and then their reports and their verbatims, their narrative would come through that tool. Because it's a recent innovation, you always get challenges with adoption at the front end. So we'll continue to signal that our expectation is that our staff use these tools that we're providing and that they provide those opportunities. So in that case, that should have been done for them.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Support for Neville?
Just through you, Mr. Chair. That was a really good question, Councillor Smith, in terms of how we reach our customers. I think that the point though is this is largely driven on a transactional basis, and where there's issues that have created that become more of a political nature, I suppose, in terms of them. It doesn't capture that type of interaction. It doesn't capture the people who have contacted me to, say they have an issue. People who have contacted you to create an issue. That's not the purpose of it. So it doesn't capture that. But I think We don't need to, because that gets captured politically anyway. As I say, on a transactional basis, I think I think this committee's drilled down what sits underneath the measurements of these. Sometimes I wonder if we're a little bit hard on ourselves, you know, because we can come out with some quite low scores actually when we're still doing a good job, just on the basis of one or two people who might have the outcome. And that might be something that you'd be interested in seeing the drill down on that. I think in terms of the innovation and excellence, you know, I think we've recognised over the last year we've got to find some way of determining how well we do as an organisation in general in terms of excellence. But the innovation one is, you know, continuous improvement, something we're always looking for. And Neville, I'm not too sure it's just about projects, but it's about projects which spurn innovation and better ways of doing things.
No, there is a component in there which I didn't mention, which is if staff have improvement suggestions, they have a portal to which they can enter those suggestions. They're not at a threshold where they'd be considered an organisational project. So we have criteria around what's deemed a project and what isn't. So for these simple, small improvement suggestions that staff may have, which they won't acknowledge, they have a portal in which they can place it. So that will become active very soon. And then it's about promoting its utilisation by staff. So one is for small ideas and improvements, and one is for big projects and programs of work.
Do you have a question?
Oh, yeah, just a comment, or quite common question. Just generally, 30% seems quite good to me, given that most of us are pretty busy and we don't really want to muck around feeding back. I mean, I'd be expecting a higher percentage of that 30%. I'd be expecting that probably 3/4 of that would be negative and positive, because that's just the nature of feedback, really, isn't it? Would that be a fair call?
Look, no, Stu, you're right. That is a good percentage, and it's above market average. So we average around about 28 to 33% on average in the response rate for the number of surveys that we send out. Of that, and the mechanism we use is scoring rate out of 10, and any score below 6 is deemed a negative. 7 and 8 is deemed a neutral, and 9 and 10 are deemed a positive. So what you see flow out of this is we're only really interested in the 9. Well, we're interested in all of the scores, but the 9s and the 10s, which are the hard ones to get, are the ones that truly give us a sense of whether or not we're nudging in the right direction. And that's sort of industry standard across customer service sectors in general. They call it a net promoter score. We call it a modified net promoter score, because we're not talking about promoting our business. We're talking about the quality that people felt around that encounter. So yeah, I think we're doing really well. And as the Chief Executive said, we may beat ourselves up a bit unnecessarily, but it's how we interpret the data. And as I said before, the verbatims show us it looks like we've got a constraint in the system that might not have been as visible to us if we didn't have the data to show us. Then allows us to, well, what are we going to do about it? That's the next question.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Neville, move on with your report, please.
Yes, please. I'll just get you to move through the next slide, please. Down near the next, and the one after that. Thank you. Just go to the next one. Okay. So this is just a quick update on our excellence program that we're undertaking we're about to commence in a few weeks' time. So this just provides the timeline really for how it's going to track, and unfortunately I just have to bring up my own one so I can read it. So as you already are aware, it covers 4 key areas: governance, leadership and strategy, come down to 25% of the overall rating. Financial management and performance, you'll be pleased to hear, is 30%. Service delivery and asset management is 30%, and community and communication and community engagement make up 15%. So we're really into the self-evaluation stage at this point, where we compile the documents that are required to present to the reviewers. Then the discovery process happens next. Independent and peer review, and a peer reviewer is still to be identified. And then we get the findings back, and debrief and support to implement those findings. And those the evaluation and findings will provide us with the mechanism for developing the improvement framework and how we measure the implementation of that. So that's the next date. Just gives the dates for when these events will be occurring. If you go next slide, please. Thanks, William. So the pre-assessment framework starts on the 4th of September and runs for 10 weeks. Then the on-site assessment approximately will occur for 2 days on the 15th and 16th. The report will come out with comparison against how we did back in 2017, and by early 2024 we should have the improvement plan ready to present back to this committee. So we're tracking well in that regard, despite all of the other activities that are occurring at the same time. The next slide just gives you a bit of an overview of the personnel who will be involved. Adam Feely there will be 2 assessors, independent assessors. You may know of Adam. He has extensive experience in local and central government and private consulting in various roles around the world. He's got expertise in local government, infrastructure, law enforcement, commercial law and insolvency and public registries. He's a lawyer by profession and previously held the chief executive role for Queenstown Lakes District Council, the New Zealand Serious Fraud Office and the Eden Park Redevelopment Board. The other assessor is David Moore. He advises on, as you see, on complex strategy, public policy and commercial issues. He is well regarded internationally and is an expert in both market and non-market valuations. Has advised many sectors, including healthcare, food and beverages, media and digital. He's a trained accountant and economist and holds a Master of Commerce from Auckland University and other degrees. And he was also made in 2015 an honorary member of the Royal New Zealand College of General Practitioners. He's a State Service Commission appointed Performance Improvement Framework Reviewer. So I think these chaps have got some pretty good credentials, and they won't be approaching this project with a jaundiced eye at all. I think they'll be coming in with a very critical one. They'll be having a deep dive into the operations of the organisation across those 4 dimensions that I mentioned earlier. And if there's any questions on that topic. Guys, I'm just happy to go. And there's 2 more, and I know that we don't have much time, but the last topic, if you can move on. Next slide. Oh, yep, sorry, thank you. I saw it. No, you're right. So, so just on the regard to productivity, it's been a question that's been asked a number of times, and wanted to assure the committee that we are focused on measuring productivity. What we've identified in the work we've done so far, it's quite challenging. And I think one of the key drivers that we want to look at is how does the flexible working policy, how has that affected some of the productivity of the organisation, either positively or negatively compared to the pre-introduction of that policy, and just noting the policy is currently being reviewed as well after 3 years. What we've identified through this process, we've had a number of workshops and discussions with ELT, is that there are a number of dimensions that are regarded as standard across the world for looking at productivity. It's not just a one-dimension approach. In most production enterprises, you'll measure resource in, product out, and time and quality along the way. However, we do a range of different activities, and so we've identified functional areas in which productivity can be assessed, and as you'll see in the table on pages 12 and 13 of the report, there are a number of methods already in place that we feel meet the criteria for measurement. Our challenge is now extracting that information out and agreeing that it is the value of it and the relevance of and the process for measuring it. So a lot of technical stuff in there. We also looked at using things like tracking and monitoring devices on our staff, and how might that work in terms of their devices, how often they use them, how often they switch them on and off, even down to wearable devices that can be used. There was a link sent out in section 17 of the report that shows, which gives a very good video. It's actually quite short, which shows what happens when you try that type of an approach. It's quite counterproductive to culture in organisations and leads to very to unintended consequences in terms of staff exiting the business fairly quickly and staff refusing to come into it. So that's just an interesting a video from that perspective. So I just wanted to reassure you that we are focused on this topic, but it is a challenging one given the dimensions we have to look at.
Thanks, Neville. Just a couple of questions on that. Is there any way that we can compare our performance, regional council's performance, under both those metrics against our peers? Because just comparing our data internally between 18, 19 and 22, 23 in terms of customer surveys suggests that we've improved, but I would rather know how we compare with our fellows around the country. And secondly, in consent processing days, is that the norm throughout New Zealand, or are we an exception? How do we rate against Northland or Canterbury or Horizon? So is that information readily available, and is it possible to compare?
Yes, I believe it is. And not so much the customer data that's up here, because we're one of the few councils who use this method. Many councils don't do any surveying, or they do some fairly rudimentary happy face type things that don't really give you the insight that we're seeking. So the customer stuff's a little bit more challenging, but the timeliness stuff, absolutely. Particularly where there's a statutory requirement for an activity to be undertaken within a certain parameters, that should be comparable. We haven't gone down that track yet, unless Chris has got a view.
Yes.
Just in terms of the latter, I think we do have to report nationally on an annual basis to MFE on some of those consenting sort of regimes. There's complexities in all of it, though. If a region's got a water deferral queue, it kind of stops processes. If you get a large number of notified processes, quite different. But that's all reported through, and we should be able to extract that information quite readily.
Maybe just a summarise. If there's something available which is out of the national database, then that might be useful as supplementary reading for a future meeting.
We'll take an action on that.
Okay.
Look, the last section of the report, and sorry it's taken a wee while, hopefully not too much of your time, is around the communications and marketing team. I've got, as I said earlier, I'll ask you to come. Just in case there's any technical questions that I'm not able to answer, that's contained in the report. This over one-page overview of the activities of the section are detailed in this slide in front of you at the moment. Really, hopefully it's relatively simple interpretation. The purpose of the communications team is clarified there in terms of that first point about upholding excellence in communications. The key principles for delivery around reinforcing the strategic direction, the use of Te Reo Māori, aligning with IAP2, which is our engagement framework, using data and insight to form decisions and direction, using others or partnering with others, and using our digital first approach and continually evaluating how we're doing from an improvement perspective. There are three main goal areas that are detailed in those three streams running across the middle of the slide. The goals, the outcomes, and the strategic direction alignment clarified alongside in each one of those sections. So very, very high level, but gives a bit of guidance, I suppose, and a framework for what the section is here for and how it operates to deliver on its purpose. If we move on to the next slide, which has got some data which is in the report. So in terms of the activity, through that period of this year, so January to June of this year, as you can see, 32 media releases have been issued, so that's where we've proactively put announcements out to the media, responded to 108 varying types of inquiries from the media, including interviews, and 897 news items have been published in relationship to the information that we've distributed and the work we do. On the next slide, please. So social media is obviously a significant platform for us, and one that continues to grow, and one that we invest in a very deliberate fashion. So you can see the data for yourself. I won't rattle through them in too much detail, but I think what's interesting is the benchmark figures, and those are performing well overall, as you can see for I guess engagement on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and Instagram, which is a little bit lower, is not necessarily a prime source for us of, I guess, of disseminating information, but it is still one that's heavily used by the public. So we're feeling overall we're getting cut through in that digital space, in that social media space. And just on the next one, please. For the same period, January to June, those are the number of views across the whole of the WRC's external facing website. So we can record those type of encounters. And I'll just move on to the last one. I think we've got 2 more slides in this pack. So this is our digital advertising performance, and the channels and the results. And I think I'll just check a few. Kim, is this ranked in order? Like engagements, or highest to lowest, or is there anyway? No. Oh, so it's by in date order. So various campaigns that have been delivered, giving you the reach and the result, the channels that we used, and what those campaigns consisted of. A big recent one obviously was Field Days, which from a social media perspective reached over 200,000 people, and had over 348 website sessions were completed of people who had an interest in the Field Days activity. So obviously one that's got a lot of cut through for our customers, for our stakeholders, our community. I'll just move on to the last slide now, which is around the use of e-newsletters. So some time ago, we still do mail outs, but they're relatively constrained now compared to what we did in past years. There was a very expensive method for sending out information that we're uncertain whether people actually read it or not. The move to e-newsletters is far easier, cheaper, and environmentally friendly, and we're getting very good open rates on those e-newsletters that we send out. So you can see the nature of those, from making Waikato even better, the freshwater policy review, strategic direction, and enviro schools, and the open rates accordingly to those that we send out, which I'm not sure of the industry standard, but I'd say that it'd be quite high across all 4 of those newsletter dimensions, as well as the those other face-to-face encounters and so forth. So really, that's a high-level view, and there's a little bit more detail in the report. But we thought we'd present this in the hope that this, or what's the intention, I should say, that it meets council's expectation, and to seek feedback on what further information you would want to see, or if you feel this information is actually insightful and useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Neville. We have questions from online from Angela, Councillor Strange. Angela, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Neville, for your report. Just a couple of questions. Just on the communications report. Back to in the media, 32 media releases issued, 108 responses to media requests, 897 news items. What could be helpful next time is to see a breakdown of topics that were perhaps covered, and then we can see if we're being proactive enough in our communications. So just, yeah, a little suggestion which might make it a bit more robust next time. And then just on the website, I note that about 15,000 views on the rates page. But if you go down to knowing how to set up payment for those rates, less than a third of that. I was just wondering, are the links clear enough for people to see what they need to see, when they get their rates information about how much they owe, to enable easier payments? Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. That's an interesting question. We can go and check to whether or not it's clear and logical, the process from checking on your rates to actually doing something around setting them up. So we'll actually have a look at that, and no problem at all. What we do know is that and we'll get a percentage as well on the number of ratepayers who pay through automatic payments. That information should be reasonably easy to obtain. And we do know that there is a small cohort who like to pay in person, and whether or not that number has remained static or has reduced over time. So yes, we'll look into that and come back and give you some feedback on that.
Yeah, thank you, Neville. Just one final thing, if I may. Just a lot of people do things on their phones, so just checking that all of our website things are mobile friendly.
Yes, Kim is nodding, and I know
Awesome.
that a few years ago that was something that we were really endeavouring to get right, and it feels to me that it's now just common functionality now for the team to make mobile friendly apps and ensure that everything can be done on a phone.
Excellent. Thank you, Neville, and thank you, Kim, for all your work in the comms space. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Question from Councillor Kneebone.
Yeah, no, look, at the moment it all seems like the right level of information. My only comment was around the social media stats. Do we have an ability to have some comparisons with other similar organisations? Because I don't want us to be striving for something that's unrealistic. I mean, we all go on social media for reasons, and I can't imagine that regional council is going to be the sexiest thing to want to follow on Facebook. But so just making sure our expectations are realistic, if that makes sense, rather than just trying to have a high social media profile. Just all of it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Through you, Mr. Chair. It's a really good question, and it's one that we are constantly asking ourselves, not just in terms of social media platforms, but also digital advertising. The reality is that there are no benchmark metrics available in either government or local government at the moment that enable us to compare across our sector. So the best benchmarks that we can use are by the platforms themselves. And so in the agenda pack that you've got, benchmarks that are there are standards set by. And so I guess at this stage, although it is a conversation that we are having with our colleagues council, at this stage we're using those benchmarks and we're acknowledging that we are a lower engagement category than a lot of categories that make up that benchmark data. And so if we are performing well against those benchmarks, then actually we think that we're doing incredibly well. Industries that make up that platform. And when you look against those benchmarks, tend to be doing very. And what we are doing is we are building our own data set, and that is also a lot of information that you receive, that really the best performance benchmarks that you can set are your. We are tracking our own data so that we can look at how do we continue to incrementally increase our performance.
Thank you, Councillor Story.
Kia ora. Thank you for the report. Just want to endorse what Councillor Strange was saying, that it'd be really helpful to have a breakdown of what media releases are being engaged with, particularly in terms of those interview follow-ups. I think that would be really useful for us. I take your point that there's not a lot of benchmarks other than what the social media platforms are constructing themselves. It would be useful for us to, in the report, be able to see a comparator to a previous period, so we could see how are we trending on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter. Oh gosh, Twitter.
X.
Oh yes, right. New name. I hear what you're saying about Instagram and we don't have a huge amount of followers there, but we have talked about the need to ensure that we are communicating more widely with our communities, and a lot of our younger communities are on those different platforms. And in fact, I believe Hamilton City Council is on TikTok, so there's a challenge for you. I think that a lot of what we do is really interesting and is really exciting. And can I just acknowledge the communications team around the use of reels and some really interesting new techniques on engagement. I think that, I don't know, I think it shows a real attitude of willingness to engage with different ways of communicating with our community. I mean, sure, Facebook is tried and true, but that is a cohort of our community now, and there is a real desire to engage with younger people, and so we need to be willing to get out of our shell a little bit. And I know that it can be risky, but well done.
Thank you, Councillor Story. Any other questions? If not, I'd like to thank Neville for his comprehensive report and presentation. Ask somebody to, if they could move the report. Seconded by Councillor Story. All in favour? Aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. So we can move on to the next item on the agenda, which is Capable Director of Finance and Business Services, draft financial performance at the end of June 2023.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as noted, this is, I guess, the report on our draft financial outturn for the last financial year, as well as providing the committee with visibility of our budget carryover process. So, probably deal with those two things separately. I guess in terms of our overall financial performance, it has been a good news story for the year. We have ended in a favourable position compared to the March 2023 forecast. Apologies, there's a key word missing in bullet point 3 in terms of 11.5 million favourable to the March forecast. After allowing for reserve transfers, that's where we've ended from general ratepayer funds. I'd note that a couple of key influences on that position are loan funded activities where the timing of the expenditure has been deferred. So 2 of those are around Project Reboot, with final project costs that will land in the 23-24 financial year, as well as the final payment for the Waikato Regional Theatre, which will also, while it was sitting in the forecast, will land in early 2023-24. Overall, our revenue was favourable by about 1.7 million. A couple of the key variances within that was the additional fair revenue subsidy that we received from Waka Kotahi through, I guess, as part of the government's economic support package. So that resulted in extra money coming through government grants rather than fair revenue. A detractor in terms of our revenue, and we'll talk about that further in the meeting, was around our investment fund performance. So both the fund performance being under budget, but the way that we are required to account for that in light of the high inflationary environment that we've all been operating under. Our total cost of service was about 17 million, favourable to forecast, with that predominantly sitting around our external expenditure through contracted services, but also noting that our salary costs were at 98% of forecast. In terms of the capital works program, so about 15.4 million under what was forecast, split between operating capital and infrastructure capital. In terms of infrastructure capital, our total works program for the year was about 10.2 million against an annual plan and forecast of 17. So the unspent funds in that area are requested to be carried over. At the top of page 23 in the agenda is the summary of our performance for the year from an actuals perspective, and then working through to the funds that are available for consideration through carryover, what those carryover requests have been, and so where we sit at the end of the year, assuming all of those carryover requests are approved in terms of an unallocated general rate surplus, and also noting the surplus funds that remain from previous financial years. I guess for councillors who this is their first year end through this council, just in terms of the carryover process. So what we do is to take a look across our actual performance at the end of the financial year and identify where we have got commitments that have been made for expenditure, but that hasn't occurred by the 30th of June. We carry over the budget associated with those commitments into the next financial year to make sure that they can be accommodated without impacting the planned work program for the 23-24 financial year. As an executive team, we have run a tighter ruler over those budget carryover requests, acknowledging that if we just keep carrying money over, budget over, then we build expectations in terms of the work program that staff are expected to deliver within a year. And so we've been very keen and very focused on making sure that we're avoiding that. So effectively, all of those carryover requests, so not all, the vast majority of those carryover requests are matched by existing commitments made from a procurement perspective. In terms of those cumulative surpluses that we're reporting, so in total this year and previous years of 4.4 million, that's money that's available for council to consider through the LTP development process. So examples of how that may be utilised is through one-off projects or initiatives where they need a bit of a cash injection, or the other alternative would be, looking at paying down debt associated with, for example, Project Reboot, which we're looking to fund over a period of time. We could actually relieve that debt repayment, which would give a sustained rates relief for the duration of that planned repayment. Those are probably the key highlights from the report. We have noted in section 18 a report back around our iwi engagement activities. I did have a conversation with the chair coming into this meeting, and this isn't quite the story that was perhaps hoped for in terms of the reporting. What we do as part of the annual report process is report on costs that council has incurred is an unfunded mandate, which I think will speak more directly to the information that was expected. So we will do that work and bring that back to you, and it will be reported through the annual report itself. But based on that high level overview of the key points, happy to take any questions from committee members.
Thank you, Janine, for that report, and a thanks to the CE and the rest of the team in delivering a positive result for the year. I think everybody should take credit for that in obviously very challenging times. I just make an observation that of the surplus, approximately 1.2 million of that, which is 2% of the wages, which was budgeted for, was not spent. So that's a significant contributor to the positive benefit. And I guess we've all heard on occasions the reasons for that. Does anybody else have any questions? Councillor Smith.
Thank you. I understand operating expenses. I understand capital expenses. Never heard the term operating capital expenditure. So can I have a quick 101 on that, please? Because operating and capital don't mix as far as
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Chair, it's really a distinction between the infrastructure capital expenditure and the capital expenditure that supports the operations of the. So it is buildings, vehicles, information systems. So that's where it's operating.
Do you not think the term operating and capital in the same sentence is confusing? I was trying to understand, and to me it's
probably operational capital, yeah. But there is a very clear distinction between those two areas of capital, where they're managed, how the costs are actually derived. So we try and just separate those two matters out.
Yeah, it's probably the only other capital expenditure. Thank you for explaining it.
Benjamin.
Questions. Firstly, just looking at the investment income, 8 graph, looks like we were 5 million. But we're really down on that. We're really way down on that. Is that true? Yep.
And through you, Mr. Chair, we've obviously got the full investment performance report that will be considered just later in the agenda. So
okay. Maybe those questions should be deferred until the next section after we've listened to.
Fine. And the other one was page 30. Sorry, page 36. I see the Waikato Wellbeing Project has a favourable variance of $650,000. I understood that we were largely contributing salary to that, not funding. So how would that variance have?
So through you, Mr. Chair, all the finances for the Waikato Wellbeing Project run through our systems and are part of our financials. So as is noted, so we see that underspend, but that's matched by an absence of revenue. So from our overall perspective, it's neutral. But this is that particular graph is reporting on the expenditure side only, recognising that that's matched by shortfall in revenue.
We are looking after.
Yeah, and it just clears through our financial statements.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other questions, Janine? If not, have a mover for the draft financial performance, please. If not, I'll move it. Second, thank you, Councillor Kneebone. All in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Right, next agenda item. Okay. Page 38, the subject draft year-end non-financial performance. Avon, welcome to the meeting. Good morning. And it's yours.
Morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, councillors. So yes, this report is to provide, it's a for information report to provide the year-end non-financial performance measure results subject to our final audit. So you can see there the high-level results at the beginning of the report, with 39 measures being achieved, 1 achieved in part, and 11 not achieved. So I'm not intending to speak to every one in detail. They are drafted there with all the points there starting on page 39. But I did just want to comment that high-level comment that we've heard before about a lot of our measures being impacted by those weather events that we've had over the last wee while. So with that said, happy to take any questions that anyone might have for the report.
Thank you, Haven.
Just
Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
a comment really, Bobby as well, in his absence, is 5.8, 5.9, that percentage of rural professionals happy with engagement. We're missing that target, and that was relating to the farm environment plans. The next one, percent of agriculture community events attended, satisfied the event, they were 38%. And again, we didn't have the information to tell them what they wanted to know. So it's that point that was raised earlier about the rural sector is not feeling they're communicated with as much as Pacific Community or iwi or the other engagements that they have.
Not feeling our love is what you're saying.
Well, it was demonstrated there, 38% out of, yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Councillor Kneebone.
We were also stuck in that problem of awaiting information from central government on those plans were going to look like, which kind of put us between a rock and a hard place as well. But and I think it's only for one event too, isn't it? If I've read that correctly.
That's right. Yes,
Yeah,
it's for the one
which is
event.
quite a challenging.
If you've got one chance.
Get it wrong, yeah, exactly.
Through you, Mr. Chair, though, I think the point that Councillor Kneebone makes in terms of has it been an inability of us to provide the information in terms of a failure on our engagement, or the inability to provide the information because of the environment we're working within? We don't actually have the information to be able to share, which calls into the question the timing of the events. But I think that clarification in terms of what we actually put into the annual report would be really useful to understand where the issue why the issue has arisen. Was it something within our control, or is it just the uncertainty within the environment that we're currently trying to grapple with?
And look, my offline conversations with some of the team that work in demonstrated as well with.
Thank you, Councillor Kneebone. Are there any other questions, Haven?
Just a quick question. On some of these, what is our plan to address them, or where would I see that? For instance, I'm just looking at the satisfaction, Tuhuya customer satisfaction, and clearly that you've articulated the items where there was low satisfaction, and they seem like things that, well, smoothness of the ride, I don't know how easy that is to fix, but some of the other things I think would be relatively easy to address. Where would I see that we are indeed going to address them, and when will I hear what the results of that is?
Yes, good question. I will look back in with the relevant teams to try and get the specific responses to addressing. I can provide that information back.
I mean, I don't just need to have it for the Tuhuya. That was just one that jumped out to me. I just think that if we're going to measure these things, the follow-up should clearly be, and this is what we're going to do to address them. And then if we as counselors are aware of that, then we can check back in and say, Haven, how'd you go?
That's a good point. And for some of them, that's a really good point. And then for some of them, there's other thinking that needs to be done that's a bit wider.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Story. They just relating to the smoothness of the drive, we could relate that to buses as well, and the only way to stop that is by talking to friends down the road and getting rid of all the speed bumps. That'll change the bus experience. All right, thank you very much. We have a resolution. Do I have a move for the resolution, please? Non-financial performance measure. Thank you, Councillor. Second it. Thank you. Thank you. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Thanks, Haven. Right, we'll now move on to the Mercer investment monitoring.
And Brian's,
is
yep,
Brian
Brian's online.
Morning, Brian.
Good morning.
Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
We will invite you to proceed with your presentation, please.
So Brian, just for your information, the report, page 1 of your report is page 58 of our agenda.
Thank you, Janine. I've downloaded the agenda so that I can lead you through it.
Awesome.
But yes,
I
I appreciate you might need to make up some time, so I certainly don't intend to step through each of these pages, and I'll just note the highlights and where to from here. So just switching to page 60, our usual market overview there, those bar charts, quite a telling story this quarter. This is just, showing us which of the asset classes and sectors within the market over the last quarter and over the last year have really driven market returns. And as you are no doubt aware, it's still all about interest rates and inflation. Things have changed ever so slightly since the last time we spoke, in that most of the reserve banks around the world are, taking a pause to their interest rate hikes. And the markets have seen some optimism in that. So, really the story of the last 18 months has been just how far would the Fed and other reserve banks need to go to bring inflation under control. But noting that most of those policies, when you talk about reserve banks increasing interest rates, most of that tends to have an 18-month to 2-year lag, and this all started about 18 months ago. So, the time is now in terms of assessing just whether those tools are, doing their job in terms of bringing some economic productivity, dampening that slightly, and as a result, bringing inflation under control. And, no doubt you've seen the news locally, which is just how many mortgages have a fixed rate element that roll over in the second half of this year. And I think the latest stat was there was still close to 80% of New Zealand mortgages would have some impact of rolling off a sort of a COVID era, 2.9, 3.1% type mortgage to a 6.5% mortgage if you were to go and remortgage now. And of course, that has quite an effect on the discretionary spending, and that's exactly what brings inflation under control. So all of those things are starting to play out, and markets have essentially taken some positive news out of the fact that the reserve banks are pausing rather than continuing. And that's, you can see on the left-hand side of the bar chart, that's really what's driven your growth assets, your equities up. So we've seen, close to 20% returns in the global equity markets over the year to date and the 1 year period. Of course, the fact that reserve banks are having to forecast that they might be keeping rates higher for longer than anticipated, that has a bit of an impact on the bond markets, because that has a technical impact. If you hold a bond and then the reality is that the Reserve Bank forecasts it will keep rates for higher, your bond value does lower slightly because you're holding a contract to pay a certain rate, but now the Fed is forecasting that it will pay more in the future. So that is just the technical nature of holding bonds. But your portfolio has weathered the storm quite well. It's actually, it was quite a trying time in markets last year. And some say it's probably the kindest bear market we could have expected, in that we had the outcome of inflationary pressures plus the war in Ukraine. Of course, that really did hurt both bonds and equities. But we seem to have, started the recovery now. And the question, simply is, will we be able to continue with this gradual recovery without those lagged effects of interest rate increases causing recessions around the world and therefore bringing us into, slightly dangerous territory again. At the moment, markets seem to be showing that, we could ride this one out, and certainly that's the optimism that we're seeing in those valuations. Looking at page 61, that shows your portfolio and the recent returns. So over the year to 30th of June, the portfolio has returned 4.7%, and that's ever so slightly behind the benchmark. So that benchmark again is the underlying universe of assets that our strategy invests in, and then the comparison of your portfolio return versus that universe is predominantly driven by what the managers have chosen to invest in underlying that. There's a bit of an effect in that slight underperformance as a result of the lagged nature of the property and infrastructure assets. So if you remember, during the period where the markets took a bit of a downturn, the unlisted property and unlisted infrastructure was fairly static, and that sort of smoothed things slightly, but we all knew that there was, some valuations that still needed to come through in those asset classes, and we're seeing the effect of that in the valuations now. So this is why we tend to look at things over the longer term period. And over 3 years, although the absolute number of 2.7%, isn't where we'd like it to be, ultimately we are at the mercy of what markets do, and outperforming the market by close to 0.5% over that period. That's really what we monitor and try to watch. So as we weather these storms, we just try to keep ahead of that benchmark, and then trust that over the long term, these portfolios, work themselves out. I may pause there to see if there are any questions. I am conscious of time and that there may be questions about the market or the portfolio.
Brian, just a quick one. The two significant underperformance, Stewart Investors Worldwide and Fisher New Zealand Direct. In hindsight, would you have done anything different in terms of managing those two, or as part of that, you take the risks on the chin?
That's a very good observation, and we do have our manager review coming up in the near future, and that's when we, in sort of the public excluded session, we'll go into a deep dive of what's driving performance. But just very briefly, Stewart Investors, as your main active global equity manager, we do still have conviction in them, even though they have had a period of underperformance. They're a fairly high conviction strategy, so they tend to invest in companies that they sort of know and trust, and then they stick with them, and they have a fairly concentrated portfolio. So we know that can deviate from the benchmark from time to time, and there can be up to a few years that you would have that deviation. But as long as we still have conviction that they're sticking true to strategy, those companies that they invest in, they still have faith that they will outperform in the long term. Sometimes it takes longer than we would like. In times like this, we would normally look at whether the manager is straying from their strategy, and maybe looking at other ways. And in Stewart's case, they're not. They're a well-regarded investor that's been doing this for a long time, and sometimes it's just a case of sitting tight.
Thank you for that. Other questions? If not, I'll invite one to continue.
Oh, it was just to say.
Sorry, Ben.
Just to say, in that graph earlier, it looks like we were predicting a $4.6 million growth by this time period of the year, but we're actually marginally just above zero. Correct?
So through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps if I can explain that graph, because it's not a direct correlation with the investment fund returns, because it excludes the inflation proofing. So it looks at the rate subsidy funding that we're expecting from the fund, plus our working capital interest. What we're looking at with the Mercer report is the absolute return from the fund, and then there's the distribution of that. One of the challenges for us this year has been, a 4.7% return for the year from the fund versus inflation that's been up to 7%, which we need to provide and set aside in our investment preservation reserve. So that shows our rate subsidy. To meet our rate subsidy, we need to dip into the reserves that we've set aside from previous good performance in the fund. So it's that bit that's represented in that financial performance graph rather than the overall fund performance per se.
Thank you. Brian, if you'd like to continue, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so just in terms of next steps, I've been working with Janine, and we'll continue to work on the next strategy review and that manager review. So that's when we bring a bit of a deep dive of each of the asset classes in front of you, and then also lead through to reviewing the current market conditions and checking that the strategy is still on track for your objectives. Now, of course, the silver lining of some of the pain that we felt in markets over the last 18 months is that that's actually been driven by interest rates going higher, which means that your foundation for all asset class returns is slightly higher. You know, if you can earn 4% on a government bond, then you certainly hope to earn more when you invest in equities. So the forward-looking analysis that we do actually has a bit more optimism in it now that we're in a slightly more normal interest rate environment. So we'll bring that all to the council over the coming meetings. And then just, generally our house view in terms of the market outlook from here is very much of the same. As reserve banks pause these interest rate hikes, it's just a case of waiting to see the effects and see how the economies around the world absorb that slightly higher cost of capital and lower discretionary spending, and of course there is always the risk that those interest rate hikes that we've had over the last 18 months, which are the steepest that have ever occurred in history, there's always a risk that could have more than the intended effect on the economies around the world, in particular in the US. But as it currently stands, when we look at the wage growth and the unemployment numbers, it looks like most of the major economies are actually absorbing this quite well, and therefore markets are starting to return to slightly normal practice.
Thank you for that summary, Brian. Anybody have any further questions for Brian? If not, we have a thank you, Mikhail. Seconded by Councillor Story. Those in favour? Aye. Carried. Thanks, Brian. Much appreciate your time and speed in moving through it. Very good. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you. See you soon.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, so that takes us to my calculations, morning tea. People would like a break. Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Madam Chair. Fits in with my timing. So we'll, is 10 minutes okay? Or you want quarter of an hour? What, 10 minutes? 10 minutes. Come back at 11:05. Yeah, don't you worry, I'll be